Okay, so that's good. We're okay,
Okay,
so
there you go. The meeting is being live streamed, yeah.
right, and I sent people that were able to get Josh's newsletter or my newsletter. Okay, there we are on live on YouTube as well. There's a little delay, so I'm not going to watch that. And everybody, you get to listen to the nuts and bolts here. Josh, you'll let people in as well.
Yeah, I'm letting them in as we're sitting here.
And I want you to know that I have 5 good questions for each of you. We'll go back and forth. I'm going to introduce everybody first. I wonder if we started this live yet.
The stream started. I think it started.
Wonderful.
We can hear the conversation.
Excellent. Excellent. So we'll ask everyone still to remain on mute so that when I start.
Light, dumbass.
You may have to mute everybody.
Rabbi, when we mute everybody, we mute us as well. That's, but we'll try that.
So first of all, you could unmute just us, or you can,
Right.
if we're co-hosts, I'm not really sure because I'm not sitting by the controls, but you figure it out.
Yeah. Okay. So here we are. And we still have a couple minutes before we're going to begin. And I'm also going to enable
YouTube is saying,
Under my picture is your name, Barbara.
I know everybody has my name, so we don't have to worry about anonymity. Okay. But I will ask everybody to please stay on mute, okay?
Sure.
And we have a couple of minutes before we're going to start. But just to be safe, I'm going to start recording now.
People that just joined have got their names on it, some of them.
Okay. But you know what? I am going to ask you to stay on mute because I will start recording now. Thank you. So we are up to 350 people. And now I have a new skill. I know how to make a link for live streaming and got wonderful support from Redondo Beach. And that was quite a pleasure. So if anybody wants to go and get a glass of water or some notes while we're waiting.
We have about 5 minutes before we start, right, Barbara?
Right, it's 4:26 and we'll start on time, especially since the live streaming is working now.
I'm just going to grab something to be right back.
Okay. And let me. And you know what? People are still registering for this. I was sending people the link and the information up to 5 minutes ago.
Right.
So, oh my goodness, I have 50 more people here that, but we'll do the best we can.
Yep.
Okay.
Josh, how would you like to be referred to? Josh or doctor? How would you like?
Josh is perfectly fine. Yeah. How about you?
Either way, some people call me Simon, Simon, Rabbi, either, whatever you're comfortable.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay. So let's see, we're still admitting people. Josh, while I'm doing the welcome and introduction, will you still please admit people? And then after I ask you the question, I'll take over.
Sure.
You know what? I'm gonna mute. May I have everybody?
Barbara, I advise you should mute everyone.
I am,
People-
I So Josh and Josh, you have to unmute.
Gotcha.
Okay.
I've done this many times. I can tell you that the moderator has to mute everyone, not because people mean to unmute, because they go away. You'll see. So I think it's
You're
perfect.
making us famous, Rabbi Jacobson. Okay, so let's see.
Rabbi, where are you calling in from? Where are you based?
I'm in New York,
Oh,
a
in New
little
York.
town on the East Coast called New York City.
I've heard of that.
And
I was
I think,
I just
I
got
think
back.
both of you are on the West Coast, right?
I am. I'm in the San Francisco Bay Area, but I was in Manhattan last week. Saw some
Okay.
Sondheim and some other shows. So I got my New York fix in. It's a great city.
There's been
Yeah,
some,
well, unfortunately, estrangement is on the East Coast and on the West Coast.
Yes, it's increasingly all over the world, sadly. So
Right. So it doesn't, it's not geographical.
no, it's not. It doesn't discriminate.
Actually, I'm shocked this has even a name. I'm so relieved to find that. Thank you, Dr. Joshua, for all that you're doing. I just found out about estrangement in a family.
everybody please go on mute, okay? We are recording now. Thank you. And it's 4:30. So we're going to begin in one moment.
If somebody wants to go on YouTube, what is the name? Where do they type in to get into YouTube?
I sent links. I can't tell you right now. I send everything out in a link, but I will ask everybody that is on Zoom to please stay on mute. So I'm going to mute all, and then Josh, Rabbi Jacobson, you'll unmute.
You just unmuted everybody.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, so you can unmute yourself. That will be perfect. And
So what's the
Okay.
title? What's the title on YouTube for people who don't speak English, but they understand it, but they don't speak it?
you know
So they
what?
can-
Everybody should have gotten an email. We will send out the link afterwards. And right now, we're going to begin. So I need everybody to stay on mute. And I just muted Josh and Rabbi Jacobson again. Thank you.
I think, Barbara, when you unmute yourself, you unmute everybody because they're all on your name.
Right. Oh, am I? But I'm not on mute now, am I?
You're good.
I'm okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
Everybody with your name is unmuted.
Right.
Right. And I keep getting ready to start. And then we, Okay, everybody, we are going to start. I want to welcome you all. My name is Barbara Dreisen. I just want to give you some housekeeping first. We are recording, so may I ask you to ensure you remain on mute. You can write your comments and thoughts in the chat box. And you can also let us know where you live. And please know that after this session, an email will be sent out with the recording, with the YouTube link, and all of the resources that I'm going to mention at the end. And unfortunately, I am not surprised by the number of people attending this evening, yearning for information, solace, and wisdom. I too know what it's like to have texts go unanswered, to have a child you love just stop talking to you with no explanation, to cry to friends and family who may think, what did she do to cause this? To isolate, ashamed, and unable to go out, to be separated from precious grandchildren. It was my personal journey that led me to Dr. Joshua Coleman 4 years ago after reading his book, When Parents Hurt. Today, Josh is an international expert on estrangement, and his latest book, Rules of Estrangement, is the most comprehensive look at this growing silent epidemic. Josh is a Bay Area psychologist and senior fellow with the Council on Contemporary Families. His ever-expanding private Facebook group now has over 4,500 members. He generously offers free Q&A every other Monday, presents webinars, and offers trainings. And every day, I'm grateful for Josh's mentorship and friendship. As a coach for estranged parents and grandparents, I've been frustrated that no member of the clergy has come forward to address the unbearable heartache and confusion that so many parents and grandparents face. And then Rabbi Simon Jacobson responded to our call. Rabbi Jacobson is a scholar, author, and founding dean of the Meaningful Life Center, a spiritual health center offering empowering life skills to improve every aspect of our life. His inspirational videos are cherished by over 220,000 YouTube subscribers, where he shares emotional, psychological, and spiritual wisdom for all. And with extraordinary compassion and insight, Rabbi Jacobson's desire is for each of us to recognize our inherent value. And so I'm going to begin by asking Josh a question and then a follow-up question for Rabbi Jacobson. And I'm just going to remind you all first, please stay on mute because we are recording. So here's the first question for Josh. Honor your mother and father. I'm very aware that this commandment says respect, not love. What's happening in today's culture that seems not only to deny that, but turns it upside down so that it's actually the parents' responsibility to earn the respect of their children? What's going on?
Well, I think a lot of things have happened in the past half century. I mean, certainly divorce, I would say, in many ways has weakened the family. There's many ways that divorce can cause one child to blame the other parent. It can cause one parent to poison the child against the other parent. The child may independently decide that one parent is more to blame and alienate themselves from the parent. But all that occurs in an increasing tilt towards rising rates of individualism, a preoccupation with self-esteem and personal growth. and happiness. So while it used to be honor thy mother and thy father, respect thy elders, today the moral framework that animates family relationships is far more predicated on the notion of, does this relationship make me happy? Is it fulfilling? Is it in line with my goals for happiness and well-being and mental health? And if it's not, then not only can I cut off that parent or family member or friend or whomever, but I should. And in fact, not doing it is an act of existential weakness. So we've completely turned the moral framework on its head, and that enormously empowers adult children and it disempowers the parents.
Thanks, Josh. So here is a follow-up for Rabbi Jacobson. In addition to honor your mother and father, there's a commandment that says, do not murder. And in his book, The 10 Challenges for Modern Times, Leonard Felder interprets this as, do not crush someone's spirit. And Rabbi Jacobson, our spirits are crushed. What's your take on today's culture, our role model leaders, and the influence of social media, and what's happened to our guiding morals and values?
Thank you, Barbara, and thank you, Josh. It's an honor to be with you on this panel, vitally important topic. I do want to begin, even though I will answer your question if you don't mind. I received maybe over 100 emails just in the last day or two, and a large majority of them, where some people were quite upset about this program. They felt that it was one-sided, where we're only talking about the parents being estranged and not recognizing that some children have very good reason to cut off from their parents, especially those that have suffered sexual abuse or other forms of abuse. So I assured them that we would cover it from all angles. I just wanted to, as an opening remark, to make sure that we do address it from all angles and understand, not that necessarily that makes the estrangement more tolerable, but there are many instances where children have actually deeply been hurt, and the parents can be sometimes culpable. So I just wanted to throw that into the conversation that we're discussing here. Murder is, look, the fact is the very essential oxygen of a human being is love. The first love we experience is the love of parent to child and child to parent. Each one of us spent 9 months in our mother's womb, protected, nurtured, embraced, fed, sustained in every possible way. So the attachment of parent and child is essentially an inherent and inextricable one, fundamental. When the child is born, even when you cut the umbilical cord, the attachment is still there and the connection is vital. We know today what happens to a child that is disconnected from its parent, especially in early formative years. It has long-lasting impact because we thrive on, just like a flower cannot blossom without water, we thrive on this connection and love. So I think it's critical to establish. Without getting into now who's to blame and what the causes are, the mere fact that a parent and child have any form of estrangement or any form of alienation or disconnect is a tragedy beyond words for both sides. It's not just for the parent, it's also for the child, because they need each other. And so we are talking about, of course, the pain of the parents, which is hard to even describe. Many people, I'm sure, here can talk about it personally. But there's also, even when a child feels whatever reason they may be cut off, it's also they're depriving themselves of a fundamental lifeline, which is the love of a parent, the love of a grandparent. So that is what we call murder. That's murder. It's not physical murder, but it's psychological, emotional, and spiritual murder, which is not a one-time thing, it's ongoing. So in every given instance, both the parent and child, everyone should be invested to try to mend or repair or to find some way to reconnect. And indeed, if there was severe abuse one way or the other, children can abuse parents, parents can abuse children. We all recognize that. There has to be ways to work with that. We're not talking about minimizing, we're not talking about parents who are trying to cover up their sins, or children trying to cover up their own. We're trying to be honest, integrity, and accountability. We all know perfection is not built, trust is not built on perfection, it's built on accountability. So that's what we're coming to address, and that's how the perspective I think we all can share, no matter who is, so to speak, to blame, or I don't think finger pointing is the way we want to go here. The way we want to go is, what do we do with the given circumstances? How do we repair? How do we reconcile? How do we find forgiveness if that is needed, and so on?
Yeah. Can I
Thank you.
speak to that a little bit, Rabbi? First of all, I agree with you, and I'm glad that you prefaced that some parents have deeply abused and wounded their children, and more importantly, aren't able or willing to do the kind of psychological repair work or empathy or boundary setting that's so essential to their adult children's needs for well-being. I think the confusing part for many parents in this generation is that we've greatly expanded the notion of what is considered to be harmful, abusive, neglectful behavior, or traumatizing behavior in particular. So many parents today who've been parenting in the past 4 decades or so have really given their children a quality of parenting that any other generation would have considered completely enviable. So when they're told that that emotionally abused their child, they've traumatized them, they've hurt them, wounded them, they're completely confused and dumbfounded by it. And my whole method is really to help parents go deeper and try to be empathic to what those complaints are, and to learn to empathize and speak to why it felt like emotional abuse, rather than getting into defending themselves. But I think a certain reason that so many estrangements are occurring and worse persist is because different generations are thinking about these things in a very different way.
Thank you, Josh. And to that end, so many of us will do anything in order to find a way to establish contact and connection with our children. And to this end, Josh, you wrote your famous 5 most common mistakes of estranged parents and grandparents. The first thing that I needed to accept and constantly to refer to. Can you tell us what they are?
Sure. Briefly, the first one is to be oriented towards what's fair versus what is practical or strategic. For most parents, by the time you're estranged, it doesn't feel fair. You're going to feel like victimized, rightly or wrongly, by your child, resentful that they're not taking, they're not acknowledging all the wonderful, dedicated things that you did for them. So from the parent's perspective, it isn't fair. But often living in that place of resentment and bitterness and anger is just going to make you communicate in a problematic way, and it's going to make you miserable, and your child's not going to want to reconcile. It's far more important to be practical. Part of being practical, it gets me to mistake number 2, which is being oriented towards guilt, because guilt no longer works. I've wanted for the longest time to write an article called The Last Jewish Mother, because in my generation, it was okay for a Jewish mother to kind of guilt trip her kid. In my own case, my mother might call and say, okay, so Mr. Fancy psychologist in San Francisco, you can't call your mother, but it was considered an affectionate act when she did that. But guilt, the use of guilt, is now considered to be coercive, is considered to be antithetical to the adult child's need and desire to feel healthy or happy or in line with their mental health. So the use of guilt will always go against them. Related to that, the third mistake is returning fire with fire. If there's a mistake that I see any therapist make these days, it's telling parents, well, you just have to stand up to your child and push back and tell them that they can't treat you that way. And that's naive in a bunch of different ways. First of all, nothing compels an adult child to have a relationship with a parent beyond whether or not that adult child wants to. Second of all, the adult child typically has good reasons for their complaints. The parent may not agree with them or like them, but just getting angry and fighting with them will never get anywhere. Fourth thing to remember is that once you're estranged, it's typically a marathon, not a sprint towards reconciliation. So you can do whatever I recommend or the rabbi recommends, and it still may take months, if not years. The final mistake is thinking that it's all about you. By the time we have adult children and grandchildren, our children and grandchildren are front and center of our hearts and mind and consciousness, but not so for our adult children. They've got their own relationships and their own parenting ideas and their marriages or their divorces or their social lives. So a lot of times estrangements can get started because the adult child just doesn't want to be as close to the parent as the parent wants them to be. But then the parent starts complaining and guilt tripping and criticize, and now you are on the path of estrangement. So those are my 5 most common mistakes that I see. And when I was going through it with my kid, I did all of them. So they're very easy to do.
Absolutely. So, Rabbi Jacobson, many people wrote to me for directions on how to hide their faces and how to change their names, which we don't have to worry about since everyone is Barbara Dreisen. But nevertheless, there is so much shame. Our self-worth and our self-esteem is depleted. And I just listened to a wonderful video you did on self-esteem. How do we deal with our shame and our tormenting thoughts?
Look, I would divide that into 2 parts. I think, as Josh just said very accurately, the last thing you want to do is to continue to perpetuate the problem. Remember, a problem between parents and children, it's not about you. It's about a relationship. And a relationship means that you need to get out of your own space. Shame is a horrible thing. But if you become completely consumed with shame, and that's your focus, you're never going to reach out to your child or vice versa, because it's again about you. Like, I know parents who've told their children, I've sat at a table trying to reconcile, and the parent says to the child these words: "You don't know what you're doing to me. You're destroying my life. I can't show my face. People say there's a wedding, there's a bar mitzvah, there's a celebration, and my children are not there. You don't know what you're doing to me." And the child will say, "Dad and Mom, you're continuing to do what you always did. It's all about you. Let's forget about for a moment how embarrassed you are. Why don't we figure out how to speak to each other?" So as much as shame is important to address, if it consumes the whole issue in a way, then I don't want to call it narcissistic per se, but I don't want to diagnose it as such, but it just continues to perpetuate a sense of just self-protection. Now, I understand, and that's why this is a complicated issue here. But I think if a parent seriously wants to figure out how to mend ways, you're going to have to learn how to listen. You're going to have to learn how to get out of your comfort zone. And you know what? You may even be right, but not always right wins. You have to know how to be flexible. And that's a major, major factor. And I'm not in any way suggesting it's always upon the parents. There's plenty that the children need to do. But it really is going to come down to everybody finding some way to get out of their own way. Because let's be honest, there are problems, and then the problems that we create upon the problems can be even worse than the initial problem. So that's how I would address the shame issue.
Yeah. No, I think that's well said. What I find helpful with parents is the concept of separate realities, which is that a parent could reasonably and credibly feel like they did a really good job raising their child, if they were loving and dedicated. And the child, or as an adult, could feel like the parent really missed something or continues to miss something. So there's separate realities. If you've got a family of 5 people, you're probably going to have 5 separate realities. So seeing it as that person's reality, and learning how to find the kernel of truth in their reality and speak to that, to speak to their truth rather than your own truth, can be really helpful. But I think as you're saying, Rabbi, dealing with your own shame is critically important, because it's hard to communicate well when we're in a state of shame. We're in too much pain. It makes us defensive. It makes us angry. It makes us self-protective. And it does make it seem like that's our primary focus rather than the child's well-being or the parent's well-being if it's the child who's reaching out.
Now, if I may, just to add to that, I would just say this. I think it also comes down to, I hear this very often, where parents will say, "I'm just here to help. I'm not sure why my child doesn't want my help. I want to come help with the grandchildren. I want to help." And their intentions are good. I have no doubt about it. I'm not talking about now someone who's criminal or purely abusive. And they don't really understand. I say, why don't you ask your daughter or your son how you can help? Maybe they want your help, but on different terms. Maybe they don't want you to move in when you decided you want to move in. You decide that this is the best thing for your grandchild. And the mother of the grandchild, your daughter, is saying maybe it's not the best thing. She may even be wrong. And that I find becomes very difficult because the parents with their good intentions says, I'm older, I'm more experienced. I know what's best for my grandchildren more than their own parents do. So I always say, you know what, once you were a parent, imagine your parents started to tell you what you should do. Would you have appreciated that? And then you start discovering that their parents often did the same thing they're doing, the vicious cycle.
No, absolutely. In my own research and practice, I see a lot of estrangements happen around that very issue, particularly when the adult child gets married and the new son-in-law or daughter-in-law has a lot of power, and especially when they become parents, then they get to say, this is how we're raising our children. You don't get to tell us how to parent our children. And that can commonly be a source of estrangement.
Barbara, can I just weigh in a minute on the housekeeping?
Yes.
I see Rashi, the YouTube stream that was announced, I don't think is working. It's a new YouTube stream because whatever the reason, let's not get into understanding it. So there is a YouTube being streamed right now. So if you don't mind, Rashi will give you the exact link that you can either pass on or share with anyone that may not be able to get to YouTube. I mean, those that are on Zoom are here, but those that are not, I'm just sharing that with you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. So I can't get another job yet. Live streaming links. Okay.
No, that means you have a bright future ahead of you.
Okay. There's always something new to learn. And that gets
Rashi just told me that we did post it on our site on meaningfullife.com. On the program, we posted the correct link to YouTube if anybody wants to see it there. But again, everyone that's on this program is on. We're talking about those that are not getting on. So just sharing that with you. Okay.
So you said a lot of things. One of the things that Josh mentioned is to always look for the kernel of truth, to not have your guard up. What might be a valid complaint that we can work on? I know myself, believe it or not, I used to be very emotionally reactive. I worked on that instead of sending those incessant texts to remind them of everything I did for them. Instead, I learned certain skills, emotional regulation, new kinds of communication. So, Josh, what is required of the parent in order to facilitate reconciliation? And on the other hand, what is required of the adult child?
Yeah, I think by the time a parent is estranged from an adult child, and typically and statistically, it's the adult child who's doing the cutting off, not the parent. Occasionally it's the parent, but probably, 8 times out of 10, it's going to be the adult child. So what I commonly tell parents to do is to write an amends letter and start the amends letter with something like, I know that you wouldn't do this unless you felt like it was the healthiest thing for you to do. Because in doing that, they're putting into the language of the way that younger adults think about family life, which is an orientation towards mental health, towards happiness, towards boundaries. Because from the adult child's perspective, they are doing it because they feel like it's the healthiest thing for them to do. Now, the parent may think, or any of us might think, it's not a healthy thing for them to do. But if the adult child feels like that, the parent has to get on the same page. They can't criticize them. They can't shame them. They can't accuse them of being selfish. They can't tell them it's bad for them, bad for their children. They have to assume that the adult child has good reasons for it. And then they have to begin to take responsibility. Now, not all parents know why the adult child cut off contact. Often the adult child will tell them, or they have told them. So you want to begin there. And this is why the concept of emotional abuse or trauma or hurt is so confusing for parents, because the adult child will say, well, you have to take responsibility for how you emotionally abuse me. And if the parent, feels like, what emotional abuse? It's still important for the parent to learn how to address that by saying something like, it's clear that I have significant blind spots, that I wasn't aware that felt abusive to you or hurtful to you or damaging to you, but I'm glad that you let me know. I hope you'll let me know in the future if I do something like that again. Can we go to therapy to work on that? Or will you tell me the next time that happens? Or are there things that you would like me to work on in my own therapy? So parents have to get on the same page with their adult children in one way or another. And I find often, not always, because there's nothing I can recommend or any of us can recommend that will always work. But I find that often that kind of approach is far more successful than any other in beginning a successful dialogue with an adult child. I know you asked about the adult child as well, and maybe I'll have the rabbi respond to that, and then we can come back to the adult child's perspective. But did you have anything to add to that, Rabbi?
Yeah, actually, I throw out a question, which I'm happy to address as well. Maybe I can hear from you. You know, my question often is one of the big hard ones is when the adult child says the following: my father or mother are toxic. They're just toxic, and they will not acknowledge it. They think that everything is fine. I say, let's go speak to a therapist together. No, there's nothing wrong with me. And I've tried everything. I'm talking the child is saying, I tried everything. They refuse to go for help. And I'm not here to fix my parent. I don't want to be their doctor. I don't want to be, they're not my patient. So the easiest thing for me, or the simplest, is just simply my spouse feels toxic when they're around the children, and we're just protecting ourselves. And the parents, they're claiming the parents just are not open to even hearing that. What do you say then? I mean, I'll share my thoughts. I'm just throwing it out to you, Josh. What do you say in that situation, both to the parent and to the child?
Yeah, well, it depends what point they contact me. If they've been estranged from the parents, typically the parents are pretty motivated to have the estrangement end. So I'll offer to reach out to the parents for the adult child and see if I can get a dialogue started. Because typically, if parents aren't responding, not always, but often if they're not responding well, it's because the adult child's saying, well, you're toxic, or you're a narcissist, or my therapist said you're a borderline personality disorder, or you're a sociopath. I mean, in what universe does that make somebody feel non-defensive and really open to what somebody has to say? So if the adult child is my client, I'll probably help them to write in a letter which will facilitate openness from the parent, or I'll reach out to the parents themselves. I think the second thing is that a lot of estrangements when if the adult child or the adult child's spouse is in conflict with the parent, they have the idea that the grandchildren are better off, also. But I think that's a problem. So I also work hard to help parents feel like, look, you don't have to be crazy about your parents, but if they're good grandparents and your children love them and they love your children, that's a net gain. It really isn't. I think sometimes adult children conflate their own happiness with, with that of their children. And they'll say something like, well, if I'm not happy, then my kids are happy. Well, that's not necessarily true. Well, there's a lot of people that weren't such great parents, but they're fantastic grandparents. And more importantly, being a good grandparent allows them the opportunity to repair the ways that they weren't good parents.
Josh, you mentioned something, and Rabbi Jacobson, you mentioned something that I have. Rabbi Jacobson, I loved your video when you described counseling a husband and wife. You gave the husband 5 minutes to talk. You told the wife to listen. And actually, I'm going to ask people to go on mute.
It's called transfer.
Unmute yourself.
So what are you asking, please? I didn't hear because of the interference.
You're muted, Barbara.
Okay, thank you. So you told the wife to listen while the husband talked 5 minutes uninterrupted. And then when he was finished, you said to her, what did he say? Tell us what he said. And she said something like, I don't know, I tuned it out. And I hear estranged parents all the time say their narrative is a lie. It's all wrong. It didn't happen that way. I'm not even going to acknowledge it. So I'm asking you, are we listening? And talk about listening.
I'm sorry to say, listening is quite a rare art today. People they talk a lot and they don't listen much. You know how it goes whenever it comes to even between spouses issues, we say there are 3 narratives: his narrative, her narrative, and the true narrative. So everyone has their narrative, and there's probably truth to every narrative. But the ability to listen to another narrative, especially if it's not comfortable, is not easy. And so what I do in these situations, I'm sure this is what Josh does. I mean, any professional, you want to serve as a objective outsider, so to speak, that's not emotionally entangled. Because the reason they're not listening is because it's emotional. We're not talking here about some objective scientific idea. It affects me. When it affects me, I don't listen so well because I have my skewed or prejudiced perspective. What you try to do is find some common denominator somewhere. Maybe there's an opening. So if you see a situation like that where, let's say, the estranged child is sitting here, the parent is sitting here, and each one has their own narrative, you want to see whether they can listen to each other. If they can't at all, and you say, so how do you think we're going to move forward here? If you completely canceled out anything the other person is saying, what's going to stop them from canceling out what you're saying? And you want to like press, so to speak, expand the boundaries, see how far you can push it. Because at the end of the day, let's be honest, we're not going to find perfection. We're trying to improve the situation. There are situations, I have to say, I'm an eternal optimist. So I always believe there's always hope. But to be honest,
I guess it would help if I took my things, right?
Muting people now. Hold on a second.
Okay, go on, Rabbi.
So, yeah. So I was saying so you want to push the boundaries, see how far you can push it. There are situations, sometimes you don't see people are not listening to each other. But as Josh said, you want to hope that their self-interest of wanting to have a relationship with a child, with a grandchild, will motivate them to do something that's a little uncomfortable, which is to listen. It's like always, it's called the path of least resistance. If it's more comfortable to not listen and they feel it's fine and the relationship will not be mended, it's very hard to change that. But what you try to show is that it's maybe difficult, but by listening, you may actually open up a channel, and you just push it as much as you can. Try to find the places that are easier. There are areas sometimes there are real blocks and real blind spots for whatever reason. And the key thing we're talking as from the perspective of the practitioner, meaning those that want to help. Whether it's one of you that's listened, wants to help parents reconcile with children, whether it's a brother or a sister or a family member or a stranger, you want to play the role of not taking sides. You want to play the role of gaining trust and making sure that you're trusted by all sides and trying to find something that's in common. Like saying, maybe for an hour you can all go out Sunday for a picnic. Can that be managed or not? And the boundary is 1 hour, and we all go back home to see, is it possible? You try to create environments where you test the waters, and hopefully everyone will be on their best behavior. Then you try to see if you can extend it and maintain it. But let's not kid ourselves. This is not simple. I think Josh said it, and I'll say it as well. Estrangement, especially as it starts becoming something that more, I don't want to call it permanent, but the longer that it's there, you're dealing with an infection that is not so easy to undo, and it's like a wound, and that wound has to be mended. But one thing is for sure, we have to always keep trying and never give up.
So he says,
Barbara, because
go on.
I think Rabbi's raising some important points. So as a clinician, as a psychologist, and typically because it's the adult child who's cutting the parent off, from their perspective, it's working for them. So they're not as motivated for reconciliation as the parents are, even though estrangements often happen initially because the adult child was in pain, or it makes their marriage better, or they've been poisoned by the other parent, or their mental illness, or they're still hurt about something that's happened in the past. Typically, by the time an estrangement is in gear, they're not in the same kind of pain that the parent is. The parent is suffering with shame, with social isolation, with heartbreak, with terror that they're never going to see their children or their grandchildren again. Whereas for the adult child, it's not easy, but it's also wedded to narratives of personal growth, of happiness. There's enormous social support today for parental estrangement. They get support from their therapists, from online forums. And so there's an enormous disparity in who has the power to heal the relationship. So that's why I say that nothing compels an adult child to reconcile with the parent beyond that adult child's desire. So what that means is that, and this is true both in and outside the therapy office, that parents often have to work harder. And that goes to my first most common mistake, that it isn't going to be fair. And so what I often tell parents before family therapy is, look, this isn't marriage therapy. This isn't where you both get to come in and have an equal say over how this is going to come out. It's more like you're divorced from your spouse and they're willing to give you an audience to see if you're willing to kind of have a marriage that's more in line with their goals. But it isn't like you're going to come in really as equals, because it's kind of basic game theory that the person who cares the most has the least amount of power. So it isn't going to feel very equal, and it probably is going to have to be on the adult child's terms, at least for a while. Yeah.
No, that very good point. Excellent point. I will say what I try to do often is actually, because of this issue, is try to equal the playing field, at least to some extent,
Mhm.
to try to explain even to adult children that it's true that you may have found an alternative and you can basically cut out your parents, and your parents can be dying from aggravation. But try to show them that at the end of the day, the long term for your own children and for the future, it's probably better that before your parents die, that there should be some relationship, because that's also part of what you're leaving a legacy to your own children. And you don't want them ever to think that they could do the same to you that you did to your parents. And not as a threat, but more just to really open their minds to see there's a bigger picture here. There's a future. We're talking as I said, generational connection. There's an expression that one of the sages said, one parent can support 10 children, 10 children can't support one parent. So there's also that imbalance. Parents, especially healthy parents, will tolerate a lot more than children do. Children can be quite selfish. Again, I'm not talking about situations where there are situations where there's a lot of justification to cutting off and stuff like that.
Sure. No, well
But
said.
both of you are saying what I say is the job I hate the most. And that is that I have to be the adult in the room. And I have to create a circle of safety where the children feel that it is safe to trust and to talk and to share. And Josh, you brought up another point when you were talking about therapists. Well, the fact is today that many therapists are advising their kids under normal circumstances, Rabbi Jacobson, to cut off their adult children for their own happiness. I always thought that the job of a therapist was to heal rifts, to teach compassion, to give new skills. I mean, so what's going on here with the therapists, Josh?
Well, I think that it's well said, Barbara. I think that therapists don't exist outside of the normal in highly individualistic culture. I mean, in the United States, we have the highest rates of individualism in any other culture worldwide. And what that means is that we're very preoccupied with our own happiness and separation and individuation. And therapists kind of operate like the new priests and rabbis, where they basically wave the wand of who you should keep in your life and who you shouldn't keep in your life. And this goes back to the notion of guilt, that people are being told, well, if you're feeling guilt, that's an example of codependency, and you don't owe your parents anything, and you weren't asked to be born, and so you have no obligations to anyone but yourself, and your own happiness and well-being is the most important thing. And if you need to cut off your parent to do that, then not only can you do that, but you should do that. A. B, a lot of therapists are not very well educated in terms of trauma. There's so much overdiagnosis of trauma. There's so much of a problematic assumption that if the Israeli sociologist Eva Luz has this saying that she said, today our lives are plotted backwards. What's a dysfunctional family? It's a family where your needs weren't met. How do you know your needs weren't met? By looking at your present condition. So there's this kind of myth that if you come into adulthood and you have a depression or anxiety or relationship failure or money issues, well, you just have to look back at your childhood and your so-called traumas and figure it out. Now, indeed, some people have been deeply traumatized. Not everybody who's traumatized has long-term effects, but certainly many people have been. But that doesn't mean that the obverse is true, that if you have serious psychological problems, that means that there's a trauma at the helm of that. It can be genetics, it can be social class, it can be neighborhood, it can be random good luck, random bad luck. So we as therapists do an enormous disservice to families by making it seem like everything dials back to problematic and dysfunctional families.
And I would add to that's why I've opened up my opening remarks. I think many therapists, as good as they may be, are missing a fundamental piece, which is the critical need for healthy love. And love does not mean selfish love, selfless love, the idea of giving that parents, healthy parents do from the earliest age, from the time that child is conceived. As I mentioned before about pregnancy and all of that, I think it's underestimated and not appreciated enough. It is critical for parent and child equally to have a healthy relationship. If you don't have it, and let's say there's even extreme reasons not to have it, there's something seriously lacking. It's just seriously lacking. And of course, there's difference between a child that's 5 years old and an adult child who has their own children. But the idea of love being severed in any way, even for the best of reasons, is a compromise. And every therapist should be working toward creating healthy love connections. And at the end of the day, there's almost nothing on earth that's as close, biologically close, than your own flesh and blood, which is parent and child, including siblings and so on, which we're not addressing here. But that unity, I mean, we live in a world today that is so many advancements, technological, medical, commercial, industrial, but what's lacking is really, it comes down to the simple fact that the gaze of a mother into her child's eyes and the gaze of a child into his or her mother's eyes and father's eyes is the vital oxygen that defines a human being. In Hebrew, the word for love is the same numerical equivalent as the word for unity. Love, unity. We all know the search for unity. Can a person really survive if they don't feel some form of harmony, some form of cohesiveness? We all know what happens when we feel life that's chaotic or fragmented. And it all begins at home. If your own family, your own home is splintered or fragmented, there's as much as unity you'll find at work or with friends, that's something, that fracture needs to be addressed. As we all understand, we're not naive. We understand there may be good reasons, there may be water under the bridge. That's why this is why it's such an important topic. But I think if every therapist, every professional wouldn't just be by the book, but understand this component called love, it's not just about self-actualization and about being happy. It's about being healthy. And healthy requires love. There's no such thing as health without love.
No, I think that's really well said. There's research by Aris Mass, MAUSS at UC Berkeley. And one of the things that she found was that in those countries where they define happiness as a form of social connection, they have much higher rates of happiness and much higher rates of mental health, whereas in those countries that define it in this much more individualized way, in the way that we do it here through personal growth and separation and individuation, have much higher rates of mental illness. You know, we're in this a crisis right now in this country of enormous high rates of mental illness, atomization, social isolation, depression, loneliness. And I think it's in part, it's certainly not all because of it, but certainly in part because of this fracturing of the family, where we're sort of devouring ourselves as a culture. And it's really causing enormous pain.
And I think a big lesson that this country can learn is that individuality and the cooperation or coordination is not a contradiction. It's not a contradiction at all. Look at the healthy human body.
Right.
There's nothing more individual than the difference between a heart and a brain and lungs and liver, and yet they all work together in a healthy body in a very coordinated and cohesive fashion. So the idea that individuality is a contradiction to relationships is a myth. It's actually can create much more damage. We agree that having harmony should not compromise individuality. But it's really what we like to call harmony within diversity is what you're looking for.
I like that term. That's well said.
Yes, and you know, you're saying something very interesting, because you were talking about self-actualization. A child has to go off on their own, you know, and I say the first person told that was Abraham, go forth from your land and from your birthplace and from your father's house, the destination is unknown. It's the leaving that's important. However, parents say, we hear them say, what are they thinking? What kind of values? That's not the way we raise them. What is making it difficult for today's parents to let go and to understand that their kids have a circuitous path of trying out different things so that they can become, healthy individuals? Josh, what do you say?
Well, part of the issue is that our expectations as parents have raised. There was a lot in the past couple of 2 to 3 decades. There was a survey out of University of Virginia which said that today's parents increasingly want and expect to be best friends with their children over the life course. I mean, I was blessed with good parents, but I don't think they expected or wanted to be my best friend. And I don't think I had that in my mind as well. And, it's nice work if you can get it, I think. And a lot of parents are increasingly, in general, a higher percentage of parents, if you look at, say, the Pew Research studies, shows that more parents today have closer relationships with their adult children than in prior generations. So there's a good news, bad news here. The bad news is that parents' expectations have been raised so high that if the adult child is pursuing, as you're saying, Barbara, a more circuitous path, they don't want as much closeness, they get married, they're preoccupied with their spouse or their kids, they're not as available, they're not as dutiful, the parent feels really hurt and upset, and they start complaining, then that's a problem. And social media and the cell phone are an enormous problem too, because it means that parents can strike out to their children from any place at any time. I mean, when I moved to California from Dayton, Ohio, and I probably didn't talk to my parents it took me a couple of weeks because we drove out here. I probably didn't call them until I got out here. And then maybe I called them collect and then talk to them again in another week or two. But, if that were to happen now, I'd be texting them probably daily. I'd expect my kids to if they were doing that. And so in some ways, our children have gotten too much of us. So the single most common complaint I get from adult children is my parent won't respect my boundaries. And I think in part it's because parents have been much more anxious. They've been much more guilt-ridden over the past 4 decades, scared about trying to get their children into the increasingly narrow bottleneck that constitutes a stable adulthood. There's research that shows that in high social inequality countries that exist in countries such as the United States or China or the UK, that parents do have to work much harder. They have to be much more conscientious. They have to be more helicopter or tiger parenting, because if they don't, the kids are not necessarily going to have any platform to succeed. Whereas other countries, low social inequality countries, say like Germany, Japan, the Scandinavian countries, the countries are oriented towards giving help to both the parents and the children. So what that has meant is that parents have become so anxious and so involved and so surveilling and in many ways intrusive that some adult children cut off the parent or want distance just because they can't. They just need a break. They need some feeling of space. I mean, I've had more than one adult daughter say about her mother, I'm cutting off contact with her because I just can't get her voice out of my head. And so, it's part of what I say, that estrangement is often a reaction to love, not to anger, even though it can get cast in that way.
Rabbi Jacobson?
Yeah, I would throw into this discussion one critical point that I see, especially if you study history. Let's just, the elephant in the room. When parents bring up their children, what is the primary thing you want to infuse your children with? What are you giving them? So many parents, especially in our modern society, say, I want to give them a good education. They should have a solid career, make a lot of money, so they have all the comforts and all the freedoms that money can buy. And when I ask parents and I say, and what about values, spiritual values, the things that are not quite tangible, the more sublime things? Well, no, that's important too, but we live in a material world. I think the blessing could also be the curse. The blessing of our prosperity, of our affluence, of our freedoms, especially as modern technology continues to make life easier, what press of one button, has a very big downside. That the spiritual values, and I mean this not necessarily in religious context, even though I'm speaking as a rabbi, but I'm speaking in universal terms. spiritual values, transcendent values. If you don't make that a priority with your children, I'm not suggesting that will be a direct cause of estrangement, but I could assure you that if there is estrangement, children will say, you know what? I didn't get that from my parents. My father was never around. He was busy making a living. And in the name of security, you know, everyone knows Harry Chapin's Cats in the Cradle. And then the child becomes like the father, not available. So I think the critical piece, and I'm talking now preemptive, there's dealing with the issues after they happen, the estrangement, but preemptive, the best thing a parent can do is create tremendous spiritual bonds with your child. Basically giving your child a message that you're indispensable, you come to this world for a mission, and I'm here to do everything possible to help you find yourself and make that contribution, make your mark in the world. I will say without doubt, parents that have that type of relationship with young children, that relationship will continue on because it just is driven by a very positive and very reinforcing message. Of course, there's always going to be challenges, but you have something to work with. If you don't have that foundation, then when there's a problem, what do you turn to? You have nothing to lean on. There's nothing that you have in common except that you gave your child a good education, a good career. So the more you can build those type of value-based connections at a young age, much more likely it'll be a lot easier to deal with the bumps when they do come, if they do come.
So Josh, you mentioned social media. And I will say that we are using too many labels. You know, I know that there's maybe 15 characteristics that make up a narcissistic person, but social media posts will say, if your mother was this, she's narcissistic. If your mother did this, she's toxic. What are you finding out? And not only that, people are finding out that their kids got married or had children on social media. What do you think about all of this?
I think social media is an enormous problem. You know, on the positive end, if you're close to your children and grandchildren, you can send them pictures, or see pictures and videos. But if you're not, it becomes an object of torment. I mean, you know, I have so many parents in my practice who will try to, first of all, they get blocked from social media, so they can't see pictures of their grandchildren, or they can see pictures, but now they're with the in-laws rather than, you know, or the step-parents' families rather than their own. So they're constantly being faced with, it's like being able to look through a window and see your children, but never being able to speak to them. So they're in a source of enormous torment. In addition, social media allows people to form these communities, these forums where people can get all kinds of support about their toxic parent or their toxic children, for that matter. Their, you know, snowflake children, I guess, on the other side of the equation, from people who don't know the players. They have no investment in whether this family stays together or not, and yet they're sort of offering up some kind of armchair diagnosis. Oh yeah, my kid's just like that, or my parents just like that. That's a total example of a narcissist, or whatever. And so, you know, and there's a great deal of anonymity to these posts as well, which, you know, historically there wasn't that kind of an anonymity. So it allows really these very toxic, to use an overused word, forces to have this very divisive force on the family.
And what do you think about this, Rabbi Jacobson? And I am going to ask everybody to make sure they're on mute, please.
Yeah, I first I concur with Josh. I mean, but like everything in this lifetime, and every blessing can be always turned and become a great liability. Social media and technology in general. I mean, just look how children use it. If it's not a means to some greater end, comes an end in itself, then it's no different than any drug that becomes an addiction. And I think it's part of the problem and part of the solution as well. I mean, but it's like we used to always say with technology, junk in, junk out. If the relationship is good, then as Josh said, you'll have a Zoom with your family, you could send pictures, and the technology will just enhance the relationship. If you have a terrible relationship, it'll also enhance the terrible part of it. And also, especially when your children or somebody starts posting all these negative posts about their parents, and today everybody's open and talks, so just put salt on the wounds. I go back to you know, what makes us tick. and everyone's talking about artificial intelligence and chat GPT and what that holds. So I contend very straightforward. If you see yourself as a robot, you see your children as robots, yes, artificial intelligence, those robots will probably be better. But if you see yourself as a soul, as a personification that epitomizes love and warmth and spirit and deeper values, then that is our future. And unfortunately, our society, for all its advancements, the place that we've failing most is the welfare of our families, our children, parents and children, and relationships, spouses. I mean, let's be honest, all those are suffering greatly today. I see it as a crisis of intimacy, a crisis of sexuality, a crisis of identity. And I think estrangement at the end of the day, in the big picture, is one of the terrible symptoms of erosion of certain powerful values. Again, there are always these circumstances that have that can explain why there's estrangement, but when you don't have the other things in place, the core values that define us as humans, anything can happen. And what we're discussing is one of the serious and most painful parts of when human relations break down, and we need to repair them.
I love you.
You know what? I'm going to put everybody on mute one more time, and then I'll let Josh and Rabbi Jacobson unmute. And I'm going to ask each of you a final question. So Josh, we want to do better. We want to improve. We want to hear the complaints. We want to send letters of amends, notes of reconciliation. How do we do this if we are blocked on social media, blocked on text messages, don't know where our children live, have letters returned unopened?
Well, it isn't always the right thing to keep reaching out. You know, there's a case to be made for stopping, and might be better for your estrangement and for your mental health. It's what I call letting the line go cold. Now, you don't have to do that forever, but if you're getting your letters returned or you're being blocked in every format, then your child is sending a very strong message that they're not really ready or able to repair. So sometimes stopping completely may cause your child to feel like you're respecting their limits. They may respect you more, that you're not continuing to throw good energy after bad. That old saying, how can I miss you if you never go away, is sometimes true in families. You're not continuing to trigger them by continuing to reach out. And every time you do that, you're sort of setting the clock back. But in closing, there was a story that a rabbi told me, and it illustrates the concept of radical acceptance, which is one of the things that estranged parents have to practice so much. Radical acceptance is to say, it is what it is. Sometimes I just have to accept it as awful as it is. And the story that the rabbi told me was that there was a woman who wanted to get pregnant and wasn't getting pregnant. So every day she would go to the temple and she would pray and please God, answer my prayers, you know, with a pregnancy, and God wouldn't answer. Finally, one day he answered and said, no. And it was a relief to her because she had an answer. And that's part of the wisdom of radical acceptance. When you radically accept something, you're saying it may not be. It may be that for now, maybe forevermore, my child won't be able to reconcile with me, either because they're too mad or because they're too influenced by the person that they're married to or my ex or their mental illness, or they just need to feel separate. But my continuing to throw good energy after bad or white knuckle it through life isn't good for my potential reconciliation, and it's terrible for me.
And you know, I took that advice and I went on a journey inward and one of learning. And that was the best reconciliation that I could find at the moment. And so my final question for you, Rabbi Jacobson, is that I firmly believe that estrangement is a flawed solution for dealing with interpersonal turmoil. When we are unable to look inward, our human instinct is to lash out and to blame and to accuse and to separate. And I heard you talking about the energy of life. It's composed of opposites, such as the pumping heart contracts and expands. But then I want to ask you, we have the yearning and we don't see the returning. We have the tension, but we don't see the resolution. So how do we light an inner flame to sustain us? And what?
I'll just continue, segue from where Josh and yourself, Barbara, just stated. I think it's critical to separate ourselves from our pains. Remember, whatever happens to us in life, even the worst things, does not define you. Even if a parent has been estranged from children and the children cut off, that still does not define you. As difficult as it is, it's important to know that. And at times, I totally agree with Josh, you can't always try because it's not going to necessarily help. But there's another thing that you're totally in control of, what you do with your life. Very often, we just continue the old patterns and we keep knocking on those old doors. There's no question that when there's estrangement or any type of painful situation, I will include that any type of trauma, the loss of a child, God forbid, or any other loss, death, and so on. You could become a victim of it and just demoralizes you and completely undermines your whole sense of being. Or you dig deeper, as you said, Barbara, you dig deeper. What does that mean? That means you have to look and say, I don't know the mysteries of life, but what am I learning from this? Perhaps you need to find ways to connect to people who are willing to connect with you. It could be, I had a situation, real life situation, where there was a deep estrangement between children and parents. And I suggested to the parents, nothing was working. I said, why don't you, I know that you and your sister don't speak with each other. Why don't you reach out to your sister? No, I can't speak to my sister. She did the worst possible things. So I said, so you're doing to your sister what your children are doing to you. But your sister, there's some hope. Anyway, to her credit, after a while, and I had to be persistent, she reached out to her sister and they started building a relationship. And lo and behold, it just added an element to her life that I firmly believe that her children will reconcile with her at some point. So that's not always in the direct way that you have it planned. Bring good energy into your life, maybe elsewhere, maybe become more charitable, start some volunteer project, start helping others. There's a powerful expression in the Talmud that when you're in need, pray for someone else who has that need, and your need will be answered first. So sometimes it's about doing something going in a completely different direction, but you're bringing positive energy into your life, and that positive energy by osmosis, directly or indirectly, will affect your environment, and have no doubt your children, even though you're not speaking to them. There's the concept also, you can pray for your child even if you don't speak to your child. You can pray for them to see, but the key thing is not to get locked in your own personal thing. I just want to share, since we're sharing a story, let me share a story about a mother whose son left home and did not want to see her for years. He cut himself off from her. One day, she would pray every day that her son would return. Whatever she tried, she didn't even know where he was. One day, a knock on the door. Long story short, the son knocks on the door. As he walks into the door, and this was like, a very awkward moment, he smells in the kitchen cinnamon buns that she used to bake when he was a little child. And it was like his favorite food, which like brought back all the nostalgia, all the warmth of his young childhood. He began to cry. And he said to his mother, he said, how'd you know I was coming today? That you baked these cinnamon buns. And his mother said, I've been baking these cinnamon buns every day since you left home, with the hope that one day you'd walk in. So in other words, we never know. You do what you have to do, and God has his mysterious ways. If you want to call it, the energy of the world has its mysterious ways. Things happen. And that's what you need to focus on. You need to focus on building good energy into your life, and have no doubt that energy in parents some way will be conveyed to their children. And I'm not talking about sending them a letter. I mean, some cosmic way, parents and children feel each other in some ways that we can't always understand.
Agreed.
I'm so grateful for this wonderful conversation. And I want to tell everybody some of the links that they will be receiving along with the link to the recording. For Rabbi Jacobson, you'll receive a link to the Meaningful Life Center that has so many wonderful resources, as well as a link to Rabbi Jacobson's wonderful book, Toward a Meaningful Life, which is a spiritual roadmap for living based on the teachings of the Rebbe, Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, Rabbi Jacobson's YouTube channel, and a link to his newsletter and social media. As far as Josh is concerned, you'll get a link to his training courses for health professionals, clergy, social workers, available with or without CEs, the link to his book, Rules of Estrangement, his current webinar series, his website and newsletter subscription link, his private Facebook group, and his speaking availability. And as far as I'm concerned, you'll receive a link to my newsletter. I'm going to be offering a 3-part workshop called Living with the Pain of Estrangement. It's, I'll give you the link in the description to that. Coaching, and I always offer a complimentary 15-minute Zoom info chat if you're interested in learning more. And by the way, this is a wonderful event gathering all of us together because it makes us know that we are not alone. There is a community of support out there. And we would like to schedule more events like this. So if you have something for your organization or an idea, please write to me. You have my email address, and please know that we embrace all of your grief and wish for the day when our families reunite.
Well, I just want to say, give a big thanks and shout out to you, Barbara. Barbara worked so hard for this, fielding hundreds of emails and getting the technology together. And Barbara's also a fabulous coach. So if those of you are looking for coaching around estrangement, I often refer to Barbara. She's very smart and sensitive and conscientious and really understands this issue. So I just wanted to thank you, Barbara, for introducing me to the rabbi. Rabbi, it was a great honor to speak, and it was
more sensitive.
And I echo that same thing with Josh and Barbara. Great honor to be with you, and I hope we continue and create a perpetual impact.
I would love that.
That would be wonderful.
Yeah.
So if you would like to unmute and say goodbye, we'd love to be able to say goodbye to all of you, and then you look forward to those emails. Those links.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rabbi Jacob.
Thank you very much.
Coleman, we love you.
Great, Dr. Coleman. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Just absolutely wonderful.
Thank you for seeing our pain.
Blessings to all of you.
I feel like Moses is going into the promised land. I hope he does.
All